a website called Things Fitting Perfectly into Other Things. You never see it coming. Objects that are completely unrelated, existing with their separate places and functions, slip together, clicking into a place, merging into a holy unit as if they always belonged together. Containers of nothing become shelters of something, and suddenly you feel fulfilled, complete, and whole. And there is no more void. What exactly does void entail? Google immediately turns up an emptiness caused by the loss of something. The void craves completion. It is a trace of something that once existed and a signifier of a bygone event. In its state of absentness, the void relies on a presence. Per Michael Fried's essay, Art and Objecthood, presence necessitates the existence of a viewer, as opposed to presentness, which is the state of completeness. If the void is posited as an object, it holds some sort of bodily relationship to its viewer. Concurrently, the viewer is detached physically and psychologically from this void object that does not attain presentness. Fried berates the idea of objecthood as existing as an overly theatrical notion restricted by presence, while venerating art as full of presentness, complete as a result of multiple pieces and complex interrelationships. Fried specifically classifies the works of Donald Judd and Robert Morris as having attained for the pointless sake of being objects, and as having attained objecthood. Their works are simple, minimalist, and concerned with shape. They thrive on their relationship to the viewer and the environment that contains them. Fried also pointedly characterizes the works of Judd as hollow, i.e. they are immersed in their own interiority. The void, too, is hollow. It exists as an object on the basic level. It cannot be disembodied from the internal. It demands witnessing and experience from the inside. Conclusively, the void achieves objecthood. At the same time, the void separates the viewer. Voids are memory traces, and memories are insurmountable. The void requires the viewer's ubiety, but does not engage him or her as art does. Although Fried undeniably prefers the state of art over that of objecthood, he does place his critique aside to re-emphasize that the viewer's experience of a work imbued with objecthood is not contingent on the minimalist work itself, but rather on the viewer's own presence to understand it. Art is about the piece, which must be flat and deal with pictorial to attain legitimacy in Fried's mind, and not the context. Resultantly, it does not necessarily attain a specific bodily relationship with the viewer. The status of being within a void is thus the catalyst that propels the viewer to engage the void and to confront the memory trace. This confrontation can be disturbing. Feelings of lacking, emptiness, loss, and absence are difficult to face. When something is void, the natural human impulse is to fill the void. The animalistic drive that propels us to seek the instant gratification of filling can be best explained by the Freudian idea of the id. In Calvin-Walled City, the id expresses itself through the rapid, impulsive cramming of high-rises into a massive superblock. The city within a city buildings lean on each other and close off the bare slivers of streets that are barely occupiable. Kowloon is the architectural realization of a hoarder amassing stuff in a frenzied attempt to fill their psychological void. Combating this disorganization, the ego assuages the urges of the id with more practical methods. When the ego takes over, so do its neat, clean defense mechanisms: denial, displacement, repression. If the id encourages Kowloon to act like a mass of hoarded objects, then the works of Michael Johansson emulate Tetris. Johansson copes with absence by packing objects into the void until it is full in a most obsessively meticulous way. Animalistic desires are subdued. Everything is cheek to cheek, end to end, and the void again ceases to exist. Do you feel complete now? And then there is the vacant. The superego thrives on restriction. Fake estates is a collection of unfillable remnants, in between pieces of the same cramming that overfilled Kowloon. Not even Gordon Matta Clark himself knew what to do with the pieces of outlying New York property. In the end, he had only achieved a catalog of the parts. Our desire to complete the void is a longing for the unattainable eidetic. James Horner classifies the eidetic as something picturable that can be just as easily acoustic, tactile, cognitive, or intuitive. There is a natural impulse toward the eidetic. the remembered comfort of a familiar place and time that can never be accessed again. Memories, as mere traces of the past, are the most unfillable of voids. They make themselves present in the placefulness of architecture, the embeddedness of moments and experiences that have passed. When Victor Hugo predicts, "Ceci tuera cela," that portable books will effectuate the meaninglessness of immobile architecture, he calls attention to the necessity of the original, authentic place. Walter Benjamin takes the concept further with his aura of authenticity, which implies that if an event is inflicted upon an architecture, the work changes from the original. Because changes to architecture do endlessly ensue in the form of events, a palimpsest of meanings develops. Architecture is therefore a container for temporal events that become memories. If architecture is so embedded with moments past, then feelings of loss and nostalgia are never more evident than in the heart of the void. Rifts, interruptions, and vacancies produce an affect entirely different from that of a fulfilling architecture. The Cenotaph de Newton, for instance, has a greater capacity to invoke the sublime, literally, than that of the Guggenheim. In the latter, you circulate the center, you perhaps perceive the artwork hanging within it, and you are comforted by coming full circle at the end of the museum. Contrarily, in the Cenotaph, you occupy one point in a massive geometry, and all you can do is absorb. Inside the vacant, the desire to act upon the void, the desire to remember, emerges. Intrinsically, memories are vacant because you cannot return to the moment of an event. If the memory is infinitely an insatiable void. Moreover, memories are chunks of a disjointed narrative. As we progress in time, we flash back to out-of-sequence images that we have done nothing with but cataloged, the fake estates of our minds. Until the intermittent becomes orderly, and our two parallel narratives intersect perfectly, there exists a perpetual emptiness. In this hypothetical intersection, there lies the potential to create fullness out of empty pieces. This is the most esoteric approach to the void. Confronted with the void, there are three immediate ways to proceed. Fill it, leave it vacant, or cut a void out of the void. This is the end. A colossal canyon surrounded you on all sides and you occupied its center. There was water below and sky above, and where you stood there was a narrow path to the other side, a cut slicing across the void. This was a moment inside the void, inside the void. Before we discuss filling voids any further, allow me to state the obvious. Architecture is a sexual act. Just ask any architecture student. Flacon de Vie, a painting oftentimes found gracing the cover of Delirious New York, portrays the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, caught in bed by the Rockefeller Center. The image poses buildings as sexual creatures, capable of desire, penetration, and satisfaction. The real picker? A Goodyear blimp condom tossed off to the side. Sylvia Levin explores the soft core in kissing architecture by means of temporary external contact. As her book comes to articulate, the surface serves primarily as a host for kissing. To advance any further and penetrate the surface, there must be a void to fill. Biological instinct dictates our desire to mediate the void. Sexual desires are manifested through art, and architecture is no exception. Unequivocally, architecture is phallic and voids are yonic. From the subtle, monumental objects and palazzo courtyards, to the radical, skyscrapers and earth scrapers, architecture becomes a vehicle for liberating our sexualities. The impulse to fill is perhaps most conspicuous when we occupy structures that do not even require filling. Whoever decided that entering the Statue of Liberty would be indispensable to experiencing New York? Was it the matter of an inability to leave a woman-shaped statue empty? Or who decided that it was necessary to climb the Eiffel Tower to occupy a fairly low-level restaurant, or to enter the caverns behind Niagara Falls to view nothing but a mist-filled window? Filling serves as an immediate action to mitigate the void. On the most severe side of filling is Rachel Whiteread, who densifies the void to the point of denying that it was ever even vacant. Her work is inviting. Individual pieces are recognizable as the objects that they are, though they portray inversions of their originals. The human and scale of her beds, chairs, and closets forces the instant recollection of positions and actions we might take in relation to those objects. Bachelard and Merleau-Ponty's proposal that the human perception of the world stems from the physical connection between flesh and environment strongly resonates with the intimacy of Whiteread's works. By proxy, her blatant solidifying renders physical one's personal memories regarding commonplace objects. Simultaneously, her work is restrictive in its emphatic inaccessibility of memory. In Closet, Whiteread's own memory of occupying the dark closet as a child propels her to fill a wardrobe and demolish its frame. By inversing and overfilling the memory container, Whiteread pronounces the original interior uninhabitable. Her aversion to the vacant is summed up in her attitude towards the nostalgic remnants of such spaces. There is something psychologically unsustainable about an empty space. It is difficult to leave empty. One imagines it as a future living space, or an office or a studio, or one imagines the life it once contained, the generations that worshipped or worked or lived there over time. Whiteread's Holocaust Memorial in Vienna takes advantage of its memorial status to solidify a moment in history, but not mark a physical space. A tiny, dense fake architecture in the midst of a plaza of tall, real buildings, the memorial shuts out viewers from all sides. Thusly, it becomes a filled void. Contemporaneously, Danny Karaman's memorial to Walter Benjamin is an open void that penetrates the earth, displacing soil and acting as a shortcut to the water below. Its accessibility and openness allows even light to enter, producing a remembrance effect completely contrary to that of the Holocaust Memorial. As you left behind the light-saturated void, you re-entered the compressed path. It was a dark, narrow hole, a burrow that seemed to lead nowhere. Oppressive walls imposed on the path, their jarring intrusions conjuring memories of the slums and the tight urban fabric of Mumbai. You penetrated deeper into the hole and progressed into nothingness. The condition of fragmented fullness also serves as severe contrast to Whiteread's works. Anish Kapoor's memory exists as a massive object occupying a space to its edges, but the effect is not immediately perceptible. Instead, the viewer must circle the room that contains the object, witnessing views of the sculpture through multiple frames and angles, until it is reconstructed from memory within his or her mind. The Church of Santa Maria dei Sette Dolori plays a game similar to that of the Venturi House, where the expected entry misleads the user into occupying an interstitial space. Santa Maria's entry door leads into an atrium devoid of program, a space the user can conclude is empty. The church itself is off to the side waiting to be discovered. The fragmented experience of this oblique circulation disturbs the expected immediate gratification of a religious moment upon entering the church. Instead, the void diverts the intended event, becoming the most extrinsic and intriguing part of the procession. Many of the expatriate artist Toho Su's works deal with fragmentation as well. The void portrayed in his works is a resultant of his attempts to merge two memories of home into one. In Fallen Star 1/5, Su smashes a model of his previous home in Korea into one of his first home in America. This unfortunate attempt to merge two environments is revealed in the modeled section. An image of quotidian domestic life is displayed in each room, save those hit by the impact where there is an unsettling, destroyed scene. In his attempts to fill the void of unreconciled memories of home, Su demonstrates the emptiness that inevitably results. Walter de Maria's Earth Room invites the interpretation of a similar situation. De Maria's insertion of static dirt into an apartment that would otherwise be occupied with human life, and his leaving it to figuratively gather dust for years to this day, verifies that the act of filling can result in complete emptiness. There prevails the assumption that filling a void is easy, yet voids are complex. Unlike holes, they are intricate. Unlike vacuums, they are conquerable. To distinguish, a hole is a hollow place without emotional substance. A vacuum is intrinsically devoid of matter and impossible to fill. It is the presence of absence. The void, however, is a trace of something that once existed, thereby producing longing and nostalgia. For the Hegelian dialectic, the thesis is presence, the antithesis is absence, and the synthesis is void. Holes and vacuums are both already empty. The void has to be emptied. The simplicity of holes is aptly demonstrated in technologically driven wide expanses within buildings at the turn of the 20th century. The Crystal Palace, for instance, was an awe-inspiring display of a grand space captured in a steel frame. Ironically, the exhibits within crammed the palace full of kitsch and resulted in an empty filling of space. Norman Foster's tactless packing of his philological library into the courtyard of the Berlin Free University demonstrates another inopportune way to fill a good hole. That is not to say that holes cannot be interesting. Maison de Verre, inserted into the subsequently formed slot beneath an existing apartment building, characterizes clever and full architecture. You might say it's a hole in one. The vacuum, on the other hand, poses a challenge to any sensible filling of space. Ruder Klaus Chapel, tucked amidst the farmlands of Germany, is a remote treasure bound to an otherwise monotonous vacuum. The American suburban landscape, where buildings rise in an often poorly planned field, is also a vacuum. It is filled, i.e. loaded, but not full, i.e. complete. Contrastingly, the figure-ground quality of European towns involves the strategic use of the void to carve out spaces. In a vacuum, nothing has meaning. In a void, nothingness has meaning. The actions of emptying distance voids from holes and vacuums. Erasure and destruction are integral processes that provoke the emotional capacity of the void. In the projects of Los Carpinteros, destruction is frozen in place and time. Showroom solidifies the moment that a domestic space is upheaved and everything loses its rightful place. Cold study of disaster deconstructs the wall, a pivotal element in the process of container, rendering it empty. Daniel Libeskind's chamberworks drawings go beyond the works of Los Carpinteros, flattening the moment of disorder to the two-dimensional. In this instance, the complete picture is missing. If you attempt to recompound its parts, you might come up empty. Disorder implies loss and voiding. The memory of the Buddhas of Bamiyan, eradicated by terrorism, is preserved in faint traces of their originals, in frames. The Armenian cemetery at Yofa, Azerbaijan, is a voided historical site where Christian tombstones from medieval times have been raised by Azerbaijan's government, leaving behind infertile land. It exists now only in the collective memory of those outraged at the actions of erasure. Erasure is also implied in the incomplete facade of the Basilica of San Lorenzo. One can imagine exactly where pieces and parts would have gone had the project been completed, but the outline of the facade will serve as a container for the voided surface. In 2007, Michelangelo's design for the facade was projected onto the building, creating a ghostly pseudo-surface, a reminder of what should have been. Le Corbusier's Villa Schwab, too, proposes a falsely erased facade in its presence of an empty surface. Its blinkness conjures a feeling of displacement. Standing at the entry, one confronts nothingness. Doho Su introduces the tangible void, an implied voiding that contrasts deliberately empty images, such as the Buddhas and Yofa. He uses fragile wireframe covered in mesh to represent typically heavy, solid objects, such as stoves, refrigerators, and buildings. In Staircase, Su plays with the impossibility of a seemingly weighty staircase floating off the ground. The function of stair is denied, and circulation made unfeasible due to the fragility of the mesh material. The stair becomes a marker for the memory of stair. It remains useless, apt only to be observed. Separated from Su's use of the stabilizing comfort of mesh, the flimsy wireframe is a result of the action of framing around a void. For instance, Robert Venturi's ghost structure at Franklin Court mobilizes the wireframe to designate the site of Benjamin Franklin's house. The wireframe stands in for the image of Franklin's house, as there is no documentation specifying what the original building looked like. Contrarily, Rachel Whiteread's Commercial Road uses the wireframe to create an original object that, rather than marking a place, marks a center that provokes further questioning from the onlooker. The frame implies scaffolding around the solid core contained within it. Both of these projects are void in their simultaneous presence and absence. The act of capturing is crucial to the meaningfulness of avoided work. Framing alone cannot accomplish a pivotal level of emotion. In other words, it would be difficult to argue that Fuller's geodesic dome is about the void. The shell containing a void, when thickened to a substantial point, is less effective than the wireframe. The exterior of Casa de Musica happens to be inflected by the typological form of the auditorium. Its thick boucher of secondary spaces is strategically molded to mirror the form of its most central space. Bagsford Church is a pure extrusion in which the boucher of the shell appears to be an afterthought. The exterior shrouds the interior in a most rectilinear format, but the connection between the interior and exterior is entirely legible. What is not perceptible is a reading of the space as a void. The internal surface unfolds in only one direction. Instead of container, it implies blanket. Generally, the thickened shell succeeds in suggesting interior, but the wireframe insinuates void. The wireframe is an additive means of capturing content. Its opposite, erasure, accumulates content by subtractive methods. When Robert Rauschenberg attained a Willem de Kooning drawing and meticulously erased its every trace, his resulting artwork became perhaps more famous than the original piece would ever have been. Sarah Oppenheimer, too, turned something less extraordinary, a room, into something more extraordinary, a room with a view. Her work involves slicing holes through walls, floors, and ceilings in an attempt to acquire a view into another environment that would never be otherwise seen from that angle. James Turrell works in a similar genre with his sky space pieces. The sky, regularly a vacuum, assumes the form of a void when framed by a skylight. The space of the room containing the skylight thus becomes full of sky. Descending further into the dark tunnel, you become a traveler through the uncharted entrails of the museum. You were a fleeting presence in a dark, persisting hole for some time, until a sliver of light cut into the space. At that moment, the tunnel paused and its walls ascended. Light poured down, a temporary break to the darkness, and you ingrained this uncommon vision into your memory. The void was filled with sky. Erasure generates loss. The World Trade Center, often considered a bad pair of buildings, was meaningless until it became voided. Michael Arad's memorial, two voids imprinted into the side of the buildings, is more potent than the original architecture ever was. The voids negate the World Trade Center but solidify its memory. In a similar vein, the Pentagon Memorial Competition entry by Williams and Chong proposes unfillable voids whose components are displaced. A complex, three-dimensional puzzle is essentially deconstructed, and its pieces spread throughout the world, creating a plethora of memorials, none of which will ever return to the original one on the Pentagon site. The Wexner Center, working with a complex set of memory layers, epitomizes both erasure and the wireframe. The form of the old armory on the site appears to be uprooted from its outline, still etched into the ground. Fragmented but entirely recognizable pieces of the armory, glued together in an almost haphazard way, attempts to produce the affect of fullness, similar to Anish Kapoor's memory installation. The difference is, the Webster is explicit about its impossibility of recompiling the pieces. Holding everything together is a patchwork of modern objects that are not shy about their nonconformity. The scaffold, pinning down the center of the architecture, is the most cohesive element in the scheme. Ironically, it cradles a void, as if to imply that the void is the culmination of all these memory fragments, that here you can occupy the vacant, and here you can remember. Memories deny access. It is impossible to return to an exact time and place. They are voids with traces of substance but no actual content. To make use of the seemingly useless pieces, Peter Zumthor contributes his design methodology. I frequently find myself sinking into old, half-forgotten memories, and then I try to recollect what the remembered architectural situation was really like, what it had meant to me at the time, and I try to think how it could help me now to revive the vibrant atmosphere pervaded by the simple presence of things, in which everything had its own specific place and form. The presence that Zumthor mentions is a state of completion, where all elements are confined to their proper places. Conversely, the action of remembering is one riddled with absence. Its arbitrariness culminates in memory voids that we subconsciously fill with our reinterpretations of past events. Presence and completion close off any potential for connection. but the vacant nature of voids invites new design ideas. The void, in short, holds infinite potential for design. The cut achieves the opposite of filling, the immediate contentment of emptying a void. According to Rosalind Krauss, the cut signifies the occurrence of an event and simultaneously deletes a function. The action of the cut in Gordon-Maddox splitting ruins the function of shelter that is intrinsic to the house, yet the action is loaded with the political meaning of destroying the consumable suburban dwelling. Similar to Rauschenberg's erasure, Maddox cut is imbued with the power to turn the ordinary, void, house into the extraordinary, void. Naturally, the cut relies on its pieces to be perceived as the cut. Emptiness is relative. To feel the condition, you must be inside of something solid. That is, the void requires containment to be comprehensible. Rosalind Krauss uses the term linguistic shifter to reference something that is full of meaning due to its empty status. The Bruder Class Chapel embodies the linguistic shifter on its walls, where the event that emptied the void is imprinted. More abstractly, Robert Smithson's mirror displacements produces an entirely new landscape from the mirror remnants of a whole that create a new whole. Arguably, the very function of the cut is to fulfill. Returning to Maddox splitting, the house in its unsplit state was the embodiment of the typical suburban lifestyle, unremarkable and apt to be ignored. The house was slated for demolition, already a voided container when Maddox acquired it. His action provoked a new composition, legible as two separate pieces bound by a central void. The imposition of the cut into the void container produced a double void and invited interpretations from a new responsive audience. Plainly speaking, the cut filled the void. The cut not only fills transcendentally, but it also succeeds compositionally. Villa Beaucrerson's chunk, sliced out of its perfectly rectangular floor plan, has purpose. Its rear facade would never be so complete without the missing piece, and so surprising in its contrast to the disordered front facade. Oscar Niemeyer's National Congress proposes a near-symmetrical arrangement of two geometrical forms, sphere and rectangular prism, that have been sliced. The midsections of each form are omitted, but the deliberate rearrangement resulting from the cut ensures that everything is in its place. Here, the building subtly implies the operation of the cut. In the Church of Sant'Andrea, the action is much more straightforward. A barrel-vaulted form becomes the knife as it slices through the interior and imposes its action on the exterior. Similarly, the slice in a niche Capore's Vaillant is so violent that its barrel vault form is the outcome of the rapid speed of moving beneath an arch. Sant'Andrea emphasizes that the sliced-out form of the barrel vault constitutes the experience within the church, but Vaillant solidifies the cut as the positive image of a movement. The potential of the cut to fully satisfy is evident in architecture such as Terminal 1 at the Charles de Gaulle Airport. The walkway tubes suspended in the terminal's enormous atrium act as voids within a void, their effects amplified by the program of terminal. As travelers enter the tubes in a state of fatigue and jet lag, the external void they are suddenly occupying appears even more sublime. The unreachability of the external void, the atrium, coupled with the intimacy of the internal void, the tube, increases the potency of becoming the slice, and emphasizes not the feeling of being uplifted to somewhere, but being uplifted through something. The act of penetration is similarly compelling in architecture, such as the Josephine Baker House and Rodin House, where the user is required to cut into the buildings in order to get inside. Each house is presented as a mystery. The Baker House is a world of sexual deviance, while Rodin House is the ghosted image of a comforting domestic memory. To access either experience, it is necessary to become the slice by means of the main stairways. From there, it is free to revel in sexual fantasy, or to behold the desolation of what should be home. Slicing produces the beginning of the architectural experience. It is human nature to crave more. In the American Folk Art Museum, what part of the facade immediately draws you in? What about Cooper Union? Or even Chiswick House? As once said in passing by Doug Graff, the villa's entrance is akin to the depths of hell. The symmetry of the facade is completed by the disturbingly stable void that holds its center. Undeniably, the cut is where all the action happens. Spiro-Kostov's theory on the street being more than the leftover space between buildings takes the importance of the cut to the urban scale. A more intimate architecture, like Croft's Bunker 599, makes use of the cut to produce an occupiable section perspective through the impossibly heavy mass of an old war bunker. The cut does not stop there as it slices into infinity, slipping underwater and designating that the slice goes on. Sarah Oppenheimer's view opening cavities, Kaisha Forum's slice for an activated plaza, Michael Heiser's imposition on the landscape in double negative, and the Tokyo Kuwait Embassy's central gap are all instances of designs that simply would not cut it had they not been cut. The remnants of light dissolved, and the vacuum receded behind you. The open pathway instantly became a tunnel, enveloped by underground rooms which you soon realized were galleries. There was a rapid descent into darkness, and for a moment the tunnel was its own room. You were suspended for an instant. You were inside, looking out, except the out was an in. You were a cut slicing through a space, a void inside a void. The most powerful application of the cut is when it is used to fill the void. When speared into a void, the cut insinuates a double void condition. That is, the cut is a void inside a physically or conceptually voided space. This intersection produces the most sentimental architectural effects. Nancy Holt's sun tunnels articulates the idea of the void in a void in its double redefinition of the landscape. The vast, vacuous desert becomes full and focused when viewed through the frames of a sun tunnel. The tunnels also emit light through minuscule holes, adding a fleeting temporal quality. No memory of the sculpture is ever the same as another. This arrangement of the forms also allows the viewing of one tunnel through another. In this layering, the multiple frames produce the effect of looking into a void, looking into a void. Aldo Rossi plays a less obvious game in the San Cataldo Cemetery, where the palazzo-like skyscraper for the dead presents itself as a solid mass, but reveals itself to be a voided shell containing a courtyard. The cut in this cubic volume follows the typology of palazzo, but denies the intended function of maintaining fresh air and green space for the living. Instead, it becomes a hollow moment, unprogrammed and encased in a perforated container, a memory place. Louis Kahn's Exeter Library also makes use of the palazzo form to create a courtyard. The container implies that it once held both a cube and a sphere. Left over is the intersection of the double void, a memory trace for deleted geometries. Speaking of leftovers, OMA's Très Grande Bibliothèque has been described by Frem Koulos as a collection of voids floating within a solid block of information. As the designer of the building, Koulos has the right to articulate that the voids are symbol spaces for public gatherings, and that the whole building revolves around them. In an unremarkably generic gesture, Koulos shoves the solid remnants of the library to the sidelines, calling them residual of the process of elimination, while the voids remain at the forefront of the design. However, I see the bibliothèque as antithetical to the idea of voids within a solid. The library is a memory. It is a catalog of history. Yes, it is dense with information, but the moments it houses are entirely inaccessible. The user enters the library not in order to experience new events, but rather to immerse himself in bygone events. In other words, the user is constantly an outsider inside a void. Voids carved into this architecture of emptiness are thus cuts through a void, or a double void. In my eyes, Koulos is right about one thing, that the most important parts of the building consist of an absence of building. Without the action of the cut, the project would only be a singular void. I would argue that Daniel Libeskind's Jewish Museum acts upon the cut in the same manner as the bibliothèque. On a basic level, the museum is a memory container. Its section is mostly non-variable save the entry stair. Levels are stacked so plainly that there is a lack of collective resolution. The star of this scheme becomes the cut layered into the voided container. To preface, cuts are commonplace in the building. Slices are all around, on the facade, in the structure, and even in the form of staircases that penetrate into spaces. Libeskind is no stranger to the cut as a motif, and the Jewish Museum is no exception to this unrefined repetition. In this regard, the building mirrors the Guggenheim, where circles are engraved into the exterior pavement, as if the building's theme necessitates premonition. Or worse, it may act like the Azrieli Center, where simple motifs based on the Tel Aviv's supermall's geometrical forms are reconfigured over and over and over. This overloading of motifs is ironically lost in one place, the central void which I will refer to as the cut. It is the only slice that is not literal and does not approach motif due to its status as an index. Rosalind Krauss's notion of index refers to an object that physically represents another object in a literal way, but is not the original object itself, for instance, a photograph. The index denies presence by introducing the condition of absence and presence. Libeskind's museum is an indexical project in which the cut attempts to be a literal representation of absence. A sense of doubling emerges here. The index is an absence and presence, and the cut is an index and a literal marker of absence. Thus, the cut is an absence as an absence and presence. If the cut is a moment of absence, it is a void, and it desires fullness. The Freudian id is especially powerful in this experience of the museum. Visitors are implored to understand Jewish history and fulfill the question of how the Holocaust would happen. The cut reinforces this urge. It teases the visitor who can look in, but do no more. The cut is fragmented throughout the museum, and it impedes the expected circulation path. It is wholly inaccessible. Peter Eisenman underscores the disconnected quality of the cut in his essay, Deconstruction of the Axis. He postulates that the cut is never understood as a legible axis in navigating through the museum. Instead, it becomes difficult to comprehend and disorienting, a non-functioning whole denied by its parts. Libeskind describes the cut as part of a system that introduces an extraneous void. I have called the museum Between the Lines. I call it this because it is a project about two lines of thought, organization, and relationship. One is a straight line but broken into many fragments. The other is a tortuous line but continuing infinitely. These two lines develop architecturally and programmatically through a limited but definite dialogue. They also fall apart, become disengaged, and are seen as separated. In this way, they expose a void which runs through this museum, a discontinuous void. Yet, the cut offers a contrary reading as well. If the cut is the generator of the in-between, in the between that Libeskind speaks of, then the lines are the remnants of the zigzag on either side of the central void. The museum, a shell, is given its form upon the action of the cut. When Eisenman reorganizes the internal cut and the external museum shell, he discovers that the unfolded zigzag and the folded cut produce inverses of one another. In the end, everything is resolved. The cut, never meant to be occupied, is in fact based upon a lower gallery where visitors can find the memory void installation. The Holocaust Tower, a tall voided shell, is inversed by the dizzying concrete volumes in the Garden of Exile. The unfolding of the zigzag inverts the folding of the void, and thus the void is filled. Like two parallel storylines, everything clicks into place. This is a story. It is about your experience of my addition to the Dr. Baudajilat Museum in Mumbai. When charged with this design competition, my response was to counteract the original building, a history museum for the city, with an addition that navigated the visitor through intermittent voided galleries in order to invoke remembered moments. To reinforce the strength of memory, I layered an exterior cut into the interior museum, creating a double void condition. The exterior cut became a falsely internal tunnel which navigated through the museum, allowing visitors an entirely different experience of the museum's spaces. At the end of the path, the cut opened into a voided exterior space in the shape of the old museum. The old museum sat in an open vacuum. The new addition, an empty shell for a suppressed memory of the city, sat beside it. Slipped between its walls was the beginnings of a hole which marked the entry to the double void. You entered it, and you never looked back. Do you feel complete now? This story is also about me. I grew up in the Soviet Union for the first 5 years of my life. I just barely remember flashes of spaces like parks, farms, playgrounds, and of course the house I grew up in. And all these fragments of architecture are voids in my memory. My studying architecture is a somewhat attempt to reconcile these memory fragments into something productive. Because of this, I'm interested in the void, and I believe in the potential of emptiness to culminate in fullness. I believe that architecture which is full, whole, and complete provides a restricted experience. The interpretability of absences allows architecture to gain a new value. The void, in all of its emptiness, is an open-ended strategy. It does not dictate specific feelings. It only allows the user himself to complete that which is half empty. Above all, I implore you to cut it out. When there is a pre-existing void form, the cut will simultaneously empty and fill it, injecting a memory space with the feeling of a new completion. So where do you start? Well,